Thomas Reeve wasn't the kind of man who went looking for trouble. In fact, he had spent most of his 63 years doing the opposite, avoiding unnecessary conflict, choosing peace where possible, and minding his own business unless he was absolutely forced to do otherwise. After retiring from a long, steady career in high-end woodworking, Thomas decided to leave behind the noise, politics, and increasingly artificial feel of Sacramento. The city no longer fit him. It was too fast, too loud, and too curated. Every interaction felt rehearsed, every face masked behind some digital distraction. He wanted something simpler, quieter, more rooted in the physical world. The smell of cedar, the hum of cicadas in the evening, the deep red of sunset over a clean, unobstructed horizon. He wanted to build again. Not furniture or cabinets, but a life. So, when he found the property in Northern California, nestled on the edge of a pine-lined ridge near a sparsely populated development, it felt like fate. The house itself wasn't remarkable. A modest, one-story ranch built in the 1980s, partially remodeled by a flipper who ran out of money halfway through. But it had the bones Thomas liked: exposed beams, solid foundation, a proper work shed already wired for heavy tools, and, most importantly, a backyard that opened up to a slope of untouched land with just enough flat space to build a proper fire pit. Not one of those flimsy store-bought things either, but a real stone fire circle. Hand-laid brick, vented and leveled with a circular bench he planned to build from reclaimed oak. It wouldn't just be decorative. It would be functional, purposeful, and above all, peaceful. He imagined himself sitting there with a good beer in hand, letting the heat from the flames soothe the ache in his knees, listening to the wind in the trees and maybe, just maybe, finding a version of the stillness he hadn't known since his 20s. Within the first few weeks, he'd already begun to make the place his own. He cleared the overgrowth along the side fence, reseeded part of the patchy lawn, fixed the garage door that had been misaligned for years. Neighbors kept their distance, offering the occasional wave but rarely stopping for conversation. That suited him fine. He didn't move here for community. He wasn't looking for barbecues or poker nights. He simply wanted the freedom to build what he wanted, live how he saw fit, and spend his time as he pleased. It wasn't until he was nearly finished laying the last stones of his fire pit, carefully angled for proper airflow, heat-resistant mortar sealing each layer, that he saw the first real sign of concern. It came not in the form of a conversation or even a knock at the door, but as a folded piece of paper tucked into his mailbox. No return address, no postage. Just his name typed on a thin strip of sticker and the words "Community Compliance Concern" in bold letters across the top. The letter inside was printed on heavy cream paper and written in a tone that danced somewhere between polite disapproval and legal threat. It stated that his fire pit did not align with the aesthetic and environmental values of the community, and therefore he had 48 hours to remove it or face escalating consequences. It was signed not by an individual, but by something called the Committee on Residential Harmony. Thomas reread the letter 3 times before setting it aside with a laugh. He had, of course, pulled the necessary permits before beginning construction. He wasn't a fool. He had verified with the county that fire pits were legal on his parcel so long as they were built a certain distance from the house and complied with local burn safety codes, which his did. He even had a fire safety inspector from the local fire station come out and give him the green light just to be safe. So this letter wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about legality. It was about someone, somewhere, not liking the look of what he built. And that, Thomas thought, was their problem, not his. Still, he wasn't naive. He knew how these things worked. He'd seen enough of it during his years running a custom cabinetry shop in the city, where neighborhood groups and business associations turned pettiness into policy. So he wrote a firm but courteous reply, attached copies of the permits and safety approvals, and hand-delivered it to the address listed at the bottom of the letter. a low, stucco building at the edge of the neighborhood labeled only as Community. Office. The woman at the front desk took the envelope without meeting his eye and offered no response, only a flat, "We'll review and get back to you." The following week, Thomas noticed changes. Small ones at first. A few of the friendlier neighbors stopped waving. His garbage can was returned to the wrong side of the driveway, lid half open. A package went missing. Then, one morning, he found his garden hose cut clean through at the base, the blade marks neat and deliberate. There was no note this time. Just a crude red chalk mark drawn in a perfect circle around the fire pit stones. That was the moment he understood. This wasn't about the fire pit. This was about control. Someone, maybe a group of them, had decided he didn't belong, not because he broke a rule, but because he didn't ask for permission. Thomas wasn't rattled, not yet, but he was alert. He began documenting everything: photos, dates, letters, even casual remarks from passing neighbors. He didn't escalate. He didn't call the police. He did what any man with his temperament would do. He watched, he waited, and he kept his head down. But deep inside him, a slow, steady burn had begun. Not unlike the one he intended to light in his backyard. Controlled, contained, but ready. And as the tension in the neighborhood grew tighter and the letters from the committee grew colder, one fact became increasingly clear. If they were expecting him to cave, to dismantle what he built and slink away quietly, they had made a dangerous miscalculation. Because Thomas Reeve had no interest in war, but he remembered exactly how to fight one. It was 3 days after the red chalk ring appeared around his fire pit that Thomas received the second letter. Unlike the first, which was delivered discreetly and anonymously through his mailbox, this one was posted directly to his door, taped at an awkward angle with what appeared to be packaging tape. Clumsy, aggressive, and meant to be seen. The paper flapped in the breeze when he opened the door that morning, and it was the first thing he saw before his boots hit the porch. A white envelope, labeled "Final Warning," stood out in stark, heavy lettering, all caps, no signature again. He peeled it off the wood, already bracing for whatever bureaucratic nonsense awaited him. But this letter went further than the last. It no longer addressed the fire pit as a non-conforming structure or a visual hazard. This time it directly accused him of violating a non-permitted installation rule and made the bold claim that his structure posed an emotional and safety threat to the neighborhood atmosphere. The language was stranger, less procedural and more personal, bordering on psychological. The document outlined not only an ultimatum for removal within 24 hours, but also referenced the initiation of administrative enforcement measures, a vague term that struck Thomas as both threatening and completely empty. What exactly was an administrative enforcement measure in a residential neighborhood with no formal municipal enforcement body? He folded the paper in half and then again until it fit neatly into his back pocket. He wasn't angry yet. That would come later. What he felt in that moment was something closer to curiosity, a cool, calculating interest in how far the people behind these letters were willing to go. He had seen it before: organized coercion dressed up in policy, soft power used like a hammer. That afternoon, he drove to the county registrar's office to double-check the zoning of his parcel and confirm what he already knew. The property was private. No restrictions had been added or modified since the original lot was subdivided 30 years ago. The inspector he spoke with looked confused when Thomas showed him a scanned copy of the latest letter, scratching his head and muttering, "We don't write like this. These terms aren't even legally defined." That was enough confirmation. Whoever was sending these messages was not operating under the authority they claimed. They were using legal-adjacent language, just close enough to sound real, but not enough to be enforceable. And that, in Thomas's experience, was the worst kind of manipulation, the kind that counted on ignorance and silence to function. He returned home that evening to find two strangers in his yard. A woman in a navy blazer and a tall man with a clipboard were standing near his fire pit, measuring tape extended, taking photos with a tablet. They didn't notice him approach until he was within speaking distance. The man flinched and turned abruptly, holding the tablet like a shield. The woman spoke first, her tone rehearsed. "We're with the Neighborhood Review Board," she said, as if that title carried weight. "We received a report about a non-permitted build that needs documentation. Do you have the right to be on this property?" Thomas asked. His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to raise it. The way he said the word right was enough. The woman hesitated. It's standard protocol for the board to conduct site reviews when... But she didn't finish her sentence. She saw it in his face, that immovable line, that quiet confidence of someone who had done his homework. "You're trespassing," he said plainly. "If I see either of you here again without written notice from the county or a court order, I'll be filing a complaint for unlawful entry." The man swallowed hard, mumbled something about misunderstanding, and they both left in a hurry, their tires kicking up dust as they backed down the narrow gravel drive without bothering to turn around. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. Not from fear, but from anticipation. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the sound of insects chirping in the woods behind his property. He had grown up around fire. His father had taken him camping every year since he was 8, taught him how to build a flame that wouldn't die in the wind, how to read smoke direction, how to keep dry wood under tarp in the rain. Fire to him was ritual. It was control and danger in equal measure. It demanded respect but gave warmth and community in return. That was the difference between fire and whatever was creeping into his life now. This wasn't elemental. It wasn't natural. It was targeted, human, and quietly malevolent. The next day, the hardware began. He awoke to a sound that took him a moment to place: metal striking concrete. When he stepped outside, he saw it. Someone had chained a "No Open Flame Zone" sign to the tree on the corner of his lot. It hadn't been there yesterday. The chain was rusted, pulled tight around the trunk as if it had been there for years. The sign was new, professionally printed, reflective lettering, bolted to a steel post. There was no city logo, no seal, no ordinance number, just 5 words, bold and unequivocal. He walked over, unchained it, and set it on the ground. He didn't make a show of it. There was no audience. That night he lit his fire pit. He didn't throw a party or invite guests. He simply sat beside it with a thick blanket around his shoulders and a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames like he had done 1,000 times before. Nothing illegal. Nothing unsafe. Just a man on his land with a fire he had built by hand, burning clean, silent, and strong. The retaliation came quickly. Less than 48 hours later, he found a letter nailed to his workshop door with a roofing nail driven so deep it splintered the frame. This time, the tone had shifted again, no longer veiled in policy speak. "Consider this your last warning," it read. "You are disrupting the harmony of this community. Fire is a catalyst. You are becoming one. Remove the pit or be removed." No name, no title, just that threat, bald and deliberate. Thomas stared at the paper for a long moment before pulling it down, his fingers brushing the sharp point of the nail still embedded in the door. Something in him settled. Not fear, not even anger. It was a kind of clarity, cold and sober. If they were going to escalate, so would he, but not with violence, not with rage, and certainly not with panic. He would respond with precision, preparation, and patience. The same way he had always built anything that mattered. He documented the letter, photographed it, filed a police report, not because he believed they would act, but because he needed a paper trail. He began scanning every piece of correspondence, keeping a digital backup of every interaction, no matter how small. He changed his outdoor locks, Installed motion-activated lights near the edges of the lot. Not paranoia, just readiness. The following day, he received a call from the county office, completely unrelated, confirming his previous request to verify property use rights. They told him that no complaints had been filed through their office and that any attempt to enforce structural changes without a legal citation could be challenged. He thanked them and hung up. That night, the wind picked up and scattered pine needles across the yard. He swept them away from the fire circle and checked the stonework one more time, running his hand over the surface like he was checking the spine of a creature he had raised. The fire pit stood unchanged, unmovable, unafraid, just like he intended to be. And as he stepped back to admire it, he realized that what he had built was no longer just a source of comfort. It had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of refusal. A refusal to be quietly pushed out of something that was his by right. And in that, the flame had already done its work. The first sign that things were about to shift from veiled threats to active interference came early on a Monday morning. Thomas had just finished his coffee and stepped out to inspect the garden bed along the west fence, where he had recently planted rosemary and fireweed, when he noticed a deep gouge in the side paneling of his truck. It wasn't a random scratch from a rogue branch or a careless passerby. It was deliberate. Long, jagged, and carved with force, it cut across the metal like a wound. He ran his fingers along it, feeling the flaked paint and sharp grooves. It was low enough to suggest a crouch, precise enough to mean intention. He didn't say anything aloud. He didn't even curse. He simply took out his phone, snapped several high-resolution photos from multiple angles, and then returned inside, calm but methodical, already logging the incident in the folder he'd created on his desktop labeled Encroachments. He didn't need evidence for someone else's sake. He needed it for his own sanity, a map to trace the shape of this shadow war that was now pressing in around him. 2 hours later, a certified letter arrived. Unlike the handwritten or hand-delivered notes from before, this one bore the official seal of a legal firm, Shaver, Dell, and Whitman, a mid-sized practice known in the region for representing various residential associations. Thomas opened it slowly, almost bored by the predictability of it all. But what he found inside still managed to tighten something in his chest. It was a formal cease and desist order, not just about the fire pit, but about a long list of so-called violations that stretched well beyond the boundaries of reason. According to the letter, he had repeatedly and willfully disrupted the visual and environmental equilibrium of the community through unauthorized installations, public nuisance behaviors, and defensive surveillance systems installed with the intent to intimidate. It accused him of unsettling the psychological safety of fellow residents, and noted, bizarrely, his history of maintaining combustive materials on private land. The language was deliberately slippery, weaponizing vague, moral rhetoric under the guise of legal language. It wasn't about law, it was about making him doubt his footing. Thomas exhaled through his nose, set the letter down, and poured himself a second cup of coffee. He wasn't shaken, but he wasn't amused either. They were getting bolder now, trying to make a paper wall seem like a fortress. He called his lawyer, not a high-profile bulldog, but an old friend from his years in Sacramento, someone who knew contracts and property law better than most and didn't rattle easily. Her name was Ellen Payne, and she listened carefully as he read the letter aloud. When he finished, there was a long pause. "They're bluffing," she said finally, "but the language is dangerous. They're building a story, one piece at a time, to make you look like a threat. If they file a motion to restrict your use of property, even without grounds, it can gum up the courts and give them room to harass you under the radar." She paused again. "Send me everything, all of it. Photos, letters, incident notes. From now on, don't just document. Mirror. If they send you something, acknowledge receipt. Don't escalate, don't respond with anger. Just keep records and hold the line. Let's not give them a single inch of sloppy ground to stand on." That evening, Thomas began scanning documents into a shared drive Ellen set up for their case. He labeled each item meticulously: dates, times, observed behaviors. He even added annotations in a calm, neutral tone, the way a field researcher might log animal movements. The more he wrote, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just harassment. It was a coordinated psychological campaign, designed not to win in court but to exhaust him into surrender. Their goal wasn't legal victory. It was attrition. A week later, he was visited by a man in a pale gray shirt with a laminated badge clipped to his collar. He introduced himself as a private compliance assessor contracted by the community board and said he was conducting spot inspections of exterior structures for safety purposes. Thomas met him at the gate, arms crossed, expression neutral. "I didn't request an inspection," he said flatly. The man smiled. "It's routine, sir. Property owners in flagged areas are automatically scheduled for quarterly assessments." Flagged. There it was, the admission, buried in jargon. "You're not from the county," Thomas said. "You're not from the fire department, and you have no jurisdiction on this land unless you're acting under public authority, which you're not. If you step 1 inch beyond this point, I'll file for trespassing and impersonation. Your name will go in the folder with the others." The man blinked, the smile faltering, then muttered something about calling his supervisor and walked away, head down. Later that night, the camera Thomas had installed facing the east side of the lot picked up movement. 2 silhouettes appeared at the far edge of the property line, partially obscured by trees. They didn't cross the boundary, but they lingered, heads tilted toward the house. One held what looked like a flashlight, flicking the beam across the yard in slow, sweeping arcs. The footage was grainy but usable. Thomas exported it, uploaded it to the drive, and filed an additional report. It was the 3rd such sighting in as many weeks. But the true escalation came not with another letter or face-to-face encounter, but with silence. For 4 full days, nothing happened. No notes, no vandalism, no suspicious vehicles parked across the street. The garden remained untouched. The cameras recorded only squirrels and wind. The stillness was so complete it became unnatural, like the lull before a storm. Thomas remained steady, continuing his routine, working in the shop, tending the yard, keeping his routines consistent. But by the 5th day, the tension had begun to coil tight in his spine. He had learned the patterns of pressure. Any break in rhythm meant someone was recalibrating, planning something new. It arrived in the form of a bill, not from a utility, not from a contractor, but from the Community Operations Board. An invoice for $4,200, itemized under categories such as violation processing, property surveillance coordination, and external aesthetics review. It included a deadline for payment, instructions for appeal, a post office box in another county, and the threat of lien initiation if the balance was not settled within 10 business days. Thomas stared at the numbers for a long time. There were no signatures, no identifying details of the sender other than the generic name and a logo he didn't recognize. 3 concentric circles with a small flame in the center. It was the same symbol carved into the bottom corner of the chalkboard left beside his shed 2 weeks prior. He called Ellen immediately. "This is real," he said, forwarding her the file. Within hours, she replied, "They've created a shell entity. It's not registered with the county or state as a formal enforcement body. But if they attempt to act on this invoice, place a lien, or file a claim, we'll have grounds for injunction." She added a single note beneath her message. "They're not improvising anymore. This is structured." Thomas knew what that meant. The campaign against him had matured. It wasn't a disorganized flurry of passive-aggressive neighbors. It had evolved into an institutional machine, unofficial but well-oiled, one that could ruin lives without ever entering a courtroom. They were now operating like a pseudo-governing body, enforcing rules they had invented, under organizations they controlled, with consequences designed to look lawful without being lawful. It was no longer about a fire pit. It was about the idea of resistance and their need to stamp it out before it spread. That night, Thomas didn't light a fire. He sat beside the pit, unlit, a stack of correspondence in one hand and his grandfather's old field knife in the other. Not as a weapon, just something heavy and real to hold while he thought. The flames would return, of that he had no doubt. But for now, the darkness offered its own clarity. There would be no appeasement, no compromise. This wasn't a disagreement. It was an invasion, and he wasn't going anywhere. The silence didn't last. By the time the 10th day arrived and Thomas had refused to acknowledge, much less pay, the fraudulent invoice sent by the so-called Community Operations Board, the next move came not from a clipboard-carrying stranger or unsigned letter, but through the subtle and calculated application of civic influence. It began with an unassuming notice pinned to his mailbox, one that bore the actual county seal this time, unmistakable and legitimate, informing him that a complaint had been filed regarding unauthorized burning activity on the property. According to the document, a formal inspection was scheduled to verify that he was not operating an open burn zone in violation of public safety ordinances. The date listed was 2 days from receipt. The notice was signed and filed through official channels, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt something deeper than annoyance or suspicion. He felt the precise weight of targeted manipulation applied through real legal channels. Whoever was orchestrating this had found a way to reach beyond the theater of fake enforcement and drag him into the arena of genuine regulation. He didn't panic. Instead, he did what he always did. He prepared. He spent the next 48 hours documenting every part of the fire pit's construction. He took new photos of the setup, measured and marked the distance from all structures, prepared a folder with copies of the original fire safety permit and communications with the inspector who had signed off on the design. On the morning of the inspection, he dressed not for work but for a hearing. Button-down shirt, clean jeans, clipboard in hand. When the inspector arrived, Thomas was already waiting at the gate, ready with every document before a question was even asked. The man introduced himself as Glenn Rhodes, a mid-level field officer from the county's Environmental Protection Department. Glenn was professional, polite, and methodical, and to his credit, treated Thomas with a level of respect that had become rare since this whole mess had started. Glenn reviewed the site carefully. He made no remarks during his inspection, occasionally jotting notes and snapping photos, but said nothing to suggest concern. When finished, he flipped through the documents Thomas handed over, nodded thoughtfully, and said, "Everything seems in line." "Who filed the complaint?" Thomas asked. Glenn hesitated, then replied carefully, "The complaint came from a neighborhood board operating under a limited civic designation." The complaint itself was vague. No photographic evidence, no specific date of infraction. "That's why I'm here, to verify whether there's substance to it." Thomas studied him. "And do you see any?" Glenn shook his head. "Not today, no. Your installation is compliant. And I'll note that in the report." He packed up his kit, thanked Thomas, and walked back to his vehicle. But just before getting in, he added, "For what it's worth, I've seen this before. They can't shut you down outright, so they try to drown you in process. The goal isn't to win, it's to make you quit." As the inspector drove away, Thomas felt something settle inside him. It wasn't relief exactly. It was a shift in posture, a squaring of weight. The confirmation of what he'd suspected all along didn't discourage him. It clarified his strategy. This was no longer an issue of frustration or harassment. This was now a systemic attack cloaked in legitimacy. And it was escalating. That night, he called Ellen and relayed everything, including the name of the board that had filed the formal complaint. She told him she would begin filing public information requests the next morning to uncover the scope of their authority and any other formal actions taken against property owners in the development. But before she hung up, she added one last thing. If they're coordinating with departments that don't normally get involved in these things, they've either got someone inside, or they're leveraging relationships. Either way, we're not just dealing with petty neighbors anymore. You're in their crosshairs because you didn't bend. The very next evening, Thomas discovered his name and photo posted on a bulletin board at the small community market a few miles from his house. The notice was styled like a neighborhood alert, black and white print, blurry image taken from a distance, likely from one of the earlier surveillance incidents. The headline read, "Notice of Non-Compliant Resident," followed by a series of bullet points citing supposed behavior patterns. Aggressive non-compliance, installation of unauthorized outdoor fire feature, refusal to participate in community dialogue. At the bottom, it encouraged neighbors to exercise caution and report suspicious activities at the listed hotline number. There was no signature, no official stamp. But the intent was clear. They had stopped trying to intimidate him directly and were now working to isolate him entirely. He stood there in front of the board for a full minute, shoulders back, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes calm. Other shoppers moved around him, some slowing to glance, others pretending not to notice. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. It was the same unspoken complicity he had seen in corporate meetings years ago, when everyone knew something unethical was happening but nobody wanted to be the first to say it out loud. When he got home, he took a long breath, opened the drawer in his desk, and pulled out the original site plan of his lot. The fire pit sat dead center in a space designated for private use. No easements, no shared access, no discretionary rights. That circle of stone was legal, deliberate, and permanent. For the first time since the chalk circle appeared, Thomas considered what it would mean if this continued. Not just letters and property damage, but the slow erosion of reputation, the subtle campaign to rewrite who he was in the eyes of others. They wanted him not just removed, they wanted him erased, rebranded as something dangerous, something incompatible with their vision of order. It had nothing to do with fire. It had to do with resistance. He was not being punished for a fire pit. He was being punished for the audacity of not seeking approval. But they had miscalculated one crucial thing. Thomas Reeve had never asked permission for things he had a right to. He had spent a life building with his hands, defending his work with facts, and navigating institutions designed to fail men like him. If they wanted war through policy, he would counter it with documentation. If they weaponized perception, he would counter it with facts. And if they continued pushing, he would light that fire again, not out of defiance, but to show them what control looked like when held by someone who had earned it, not inherited it, not voted it in, earned it, with sweat, stone, and patience. The midpoint had passed, and from here on there would be no more illusions of peace. By the time October rolled in and the pine trees along the ridge began shedding their color into brittle gold, Thomas had adapted to a new rhythm, one of permanent tension wrapped in quiet resistance. He had come to expect small violations, overturned bins, unexplained visits, passive-aggressive mailers posing as friendly reminders. He logged everything, documented every interaction, and kept his digital archive neatly indexed in the cloud and on 2 separate encrypted drives. Every morning, he reviewed the footage from his cameras, not out of fear, but from the same compulsion a watchmaker has for calibration. He needed to know what had changed, what remained, and where the next move might be hidden. Ellen had filed 3 formal complaints on his behalf and submitted 2 subpoenas to uncover the financial records of the Community Operations Board, which, according to early findings, had never legally registered as a nonprofit nor submitted a single public budget disclosure. But the delays, redirections, and opaque shell organizations made progress slow. Thomas knew this was intentional. They weren't in a hurry to win. They were in a hurry to wear him down. The true escalation didn't come as a surprise. It came as an inevitability. One late Thursday afternoon, Thomas returned from a supply run to find his front gate chained shut with a steel padlock not belonging to him. A laminated sign was attached. Property closed, pending safety hearing. The font mimicked county signage, but on close inspection, the logo in the corner was off, slightly crooked and smudged, a counterfeit emblem used just convincingly enough to fool a passerby. Thomas took a bolt cutter from his truck and snapped the lock with a clean motion. He folded the sign and slipped it into his folder marked Forgery Attempts. But the message had already been sent. His home was now a target not just of legal harassment, but of physical containment. The next morning, Ellen called with news. The board had attempted to file a temporary injunction to halt all outdoor combustion activity within a 100-foot radius of his home, citing fabricated complaints of smoke inhalation, minor property damage from ash drift, and psychological distress caused by fire visibility. The judge rejected the motion without a hearing, stating that the claims lacked supporting evidence and that their legal standing as a neighborhood governance body was still under review. But the motion had been filed nonetheless, and public records would now reflect that Thomas had been formally challenged regarding his behavior on the property. That was the goal all along. Even without a win, the footprint of suspicion was created, another pebble in the mountain of invented doubt. Later that week, he noticed something strange about the mailbox. It had been shifted, tilted about 10 degrees off-center. At first, he thought it was wind or a drunk driver. But when he opened it, he found nothing inside. No mail, no flyers, just a printed photo. It was black and white, slightly grainy, taken from a low angle in the early morning light. The image was of Thomas, standing at his fire pit with his back to the camera, hands resting on the bench, staring into a flame that no longer existed. The photo had been taken weeks earlier. It had a single word typed in the corner in small, cold letters. Smoldering. There was no sender, no return address, and no context. Just that image, proof that someone had been close enough without his knowledge watching. Framing him, he brought the photo to Ellen. She told him to keep it, log it, and be prepared for more. They're collecting a narrative, she said. A string of breadcrumbs that, taken alone, mean nothing. But together they build implication, fire, solitude, non-compliance. You're being positioned as unstable. That's the storyline they're pushing, and now they're seeding it wherever they can. Sure enough, a week later, Thomas received a notice from his insurance provider. Anonymous claims had been filed questioning the safety of his property. They were conducting a review and had placed a temporary hold on certain coverage items until the matter was resolved. His rates were frozen, and a field adjuster would be visiting the home within 10 business days. No one from the provider could explain what triggered the review. It had all come through external channels. Still, Thomas did not bend. He removed nothing. He made no statements. Instead, he reinforced the perimeter of his home with gravel trenches to minimize ember travel, pruned back tree limbs, re-inspected his own fire pit under daylight and dusk to ensure its stability. He took photos, logged changes, created a record of defensible, preventative action that could be used in court if needed. He replaced his security lights with infrared-capable motion sensors and upgraded the resolution of all outdoor cameras. He ordered no signage, made no declarations, but his property, once passive and open, now watched every inch of its own boundary. And yet, they kept coming. On the second Monday of the month, while walking the edge of his property line with his dog, an aging black lab named Trooper, Thomas discovered a stake in the ground near the eastern edge of his fence. A small plastic flag fluttered at its tip, marked with the letters CASHADE. The code matched a zoning identifier he remembered from his research, proposals for common access shading easements designed for planned community spaces. He had seen this code once before in county archives. It was used in a failed proposal to convert private residential property into a shared pedestrian zone. And now it was on his land. The flag was the first of 3. The second appeared 2 days later, 10 yards deeper into the woods that separated his backyard from the neighboring parcel. The third appeared that Friday, at the mouth of his driveway. Each one marked a triangle that, if connected, would form a corridor, one that cut directly across his property from the development entrance to the nature preserve beyond it. It wasn't just a violation. It was a projection, an attempt to manifest control through infrastructure. Thomas removed all 3 flags, photographed their placement, and submitted a formal complaint to the county surveyor's office, which responded 2 days later confirming that no public projects had been registered in the area. The flags were unauthorized, but that didn't stop their appearance. The day after he received the response, someone painted a faint white line across the gravel path behind his house, barely visible but unmistakably directional. The psychological element of it all was no longer subtle. It was now openly performative. They wanted him to react, to lash out, to break protocol and give them the aggression they had been trying to manufacture. But he didn't. He cleaned the line with a wire brush, washed the gravel with a hose, and documented the paint residue. He filed another report. It was Trooper who took the brunt of the next move. On a quiet Sunday evening, after a routine walk along the back trail, the dog began limping. At first, Thomas assumed it was age, arthritis, fatigue. But by the next morning, the limp had worsened. He examined the paw and found small splinters of translucent plastic embedded between the pads. Barbed, thin, and deliberately scattered. He scoured the trail the next day and discovered a cluster of them. Cut zip ties or plastic bristles sharpened to pierce skin and burrow. They had been buried beneath dry leaves, meant to harm, not to kill, but to instill a message. Even the dog wasn't safe. Thomas didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because of calculation. This wasn't a mistake. It was precision, escalation by design. The methods mirrored those used in intimidation operations he'd once read about in civil litigation reports, layered attacks designed to fragment a person's support network, their sense of safety, their emotional stability. They couldn't win by law, so they had turned to disruption. He treated Trooper's paw carefully, kept the dog close, and added that entry to his growing folder of indirect aggression. Ellen, when she heard about it, went quiet on the phone. Then she said, "We need a public record. No more private complaints. This needs exposure on paper, in court or in front of a mediator. If they think they can keep you isolated, they'll escalate again. And next time, it won't be plastic." So Thomas agreed. He began the process of requesting a formal hearing, a procedural right he held as a property owner under the state's Property Rights Protection Act. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was official, and it could not be ignored. That week, as he waited for confirmation of the hearing date, he lit his fire pit again. Not at night, but in the afternoon. Openly, lawfully, with full water reserves nearby and all documentation posted in a laminated display board beside the circle. The flame was steady, controlled. Within hours, several residents appeared on the edge of their properties. Some watched from a distance. Others took photos. One woman whispered something to a man beside her, who nodded and scribbled in a notebook. But none of them approached. None of them dared. Thomas sat by the flame with Trooper curled at his feet, his hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on the slow dance of orange and blue that rose in defiance of every cold document they'd tried to use against him. They wanted submission. Instead, they got documentation. They wanted retreat. Instead, they found a man who had done everything by the book, and who would, if necessary, take that book and use it as fuel. Not to destroy, but to outlast. And deep down, he suspected they had finally realized if they wanted to bury him, they should have brought more than paper, because stone does not burn, and fire does not fear the wind. The day of the hearing arrived under a sky choked with smoke, not from Thomas's fire pit, but from a prescribed burn several miles north, orchestrated by county forestry officials. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he dressed in clean slacks and a pressed flannel shirt, he watched the gray haze settle over the pines with the detached calm of a man who had grown used to symbolic warfare. Everything around him had become metaphor. Mailboxes as battlegrounds, flags as borders, fire as defiance. And now, even the air itself carried weight. He locked the gate behind him, not because he feared trespassers in his absence, but because it had become ritual. Every motion was part of the posture now, part of the silent language he had developed to counter theirs. The hearing was held at the County Mediation Center, a sterile building tucked between a dentist's office and a nonprofit arts warehouse. The room itself was neutral. White walls, square carpet tiles, an elongated table ringed with worn black chairs. At the far end sat the presiding mediator, a woman named Irene Holloway, whose face bore the carefully smoothed expression of someone long accustomed to listening without reacting. On one side sat Thomas and Ellen. On the other, 3 members of the Community Operations Board, including Karen Delroy herself. She wore the same ivory blouse Thomas had seen her in during one of the early surveillance recordings, a subtle uniform, calculated and cold. Her hair was pulled tight, and beside her sat a man in a slate-gray suit who introduced himself as Charles Barrington, legal counsel for the board. He spoke first, outlining a list of supposed infractions committed by Thomas over the previous 5 months. The tone was clinical, detached, and relentless. He recited dates, invoked clauses, referenced neighborhood expectations not grounded in municipal law, and used words like environmental instability, psychological disturbance, and neighboring distress. His voice never rose, but its intent was clear: to bury Thomas in a paper trail of invented offenses, to make the sheer weight of accusation enough to imply guilt. Ellen responded with precision. She countered every point with documentation, citing specific ordinances and legal exemptions. She presented permits, maps, time-stamped footage, and filed complaints that predated every escalation. She exposed the board's lack of registration as a formal legal entity, their misuse of county terminology, and their repeated attempts to assert control through forgery and harassment. Each piece was laid out like evidence in a criminal case, and the mediator listened in silence, occasionally scribbling notes, her eyes shifting only slightly between speakers. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he did not perform. He did not posture. He simply stated facts, what he had built, why he had built it, and the steps he took to ensure it was compliant. He spoke of the letters, the flags, the plastic shards that wounded his dog. He never once used the word harassment. He didn't have to. Every page Ellen handed across the table carried that weight for him. Midway through the hearing, Barrington attempted a pivot. He leaned forward and said, almost gently, "We're not here to punish Mr. Reeve. We're here to protect community values. This isn't about one fire pit. It's about ensuring cohesion, about safeguarding peace." Thomas stared at him for a moment, then said evenly, "Peace doesn't begin with forged documents, threats, and surveillance. You didn't want cohesion. You wanted conformity." There was a pause in the room then, a pause that felt like breath held at the edge of a cliff. Even the mediator looked up. For the first time, Karen's face betrayed something. Displeasure, maybe, or doubt. But she said nothing. The ruling wouldn't come that day. Irene informed them that the session had raised serious procedural questions that required further review. She would submit a written decision within 10 business days. But the weight in the room had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Thomas hadn't just defended himself. He had dismantled the scaffolding of authority they had built around illusion. They hadn't expected him to be so methodical, so grounded. They had prepared for emotion. Instead, he brought evidence. They had counted on silence. Instead, he spoke. When Thomas left the building, the smoke had thickened. The sky had turned a dull ochre, and the wind carried the acrid sting of burning pine needles. He stood outside for a moment, drawing in a slow breath through his nose, then drove home in silence, windows down, music off. There was nothing to celebrate. Not yet. But there was something else. Something harder to name. Not triumph, not victory, but a certain kind of rightness, a realignment. That night he lit the fire. It wasn't for show, it wasn't protest, it was for himself. He stacked the wood carefully, fed the flames slowly, sat on the oak bench he had finished just 2 days earlier. Trooper lay beside him, paw bandaged but steady, eyes half closed. Across the street, lights flicked on in Karen's house. Curtains shifted. The figures watching from the windows did not approach. They had learned, finally, what kind of man he was. Not loud, not violent, not reckless, just enduring. And then, something unexpected happened. One by one, a few neighbors stepped out of their houses. First was an older man in a tan jacket whom Thomas had never spoken to. Then came a woman who lived 3 lots over, the one who always walked her terrier at dawn. They didn't say anything. They didn't cross the street, but they stood outside, watching the fire, not with fear, but with stillness, recognition, maybe even respect. A child's voice called from a yard. "Is that a real fire?" A parent hushed the question. Thomas looked at the flame, then at the horizon, and understood. This wasn't over. The ruling hadn't been made. The war wasn't won. But the narrative had cracked. The image they had built of him, a danger, a disruption, an outsider, no longer held. The fire had burned through the lie. And in that moment, surrounded by the low roar of flame and the quiet breath of a community that had started, just barely, to question its own story, Thomas knew he had done the only thing that mattered. He had stayed. He had not let them decide who he was. The ruling came 11 days later in a manila envelope marked Confidential Determination, Private Mediation Proceedings. Thomas waited until the late afternoon sun had slid low enough across the deck to paint the pine shadows long and slanted before opening it. There was no ceremony in the action, no rush. Just a steady hand slicing through the seal and a slow, practiced pace as he unfolded the document. Inside, the words were clear, direct, and, for once, undeniably final. The mediator had determined that the so-called Community Operations Board had exceeded any reasonable scope of influence and had acted in bad faith, weaponizing ambiguous language and social structures to enforce an authority they did not legally possess. All complaints lodged against Thomas regarding his fire pit were dismissed. Furthermore, a formal recommendation was being issued to the County Legal Review Board to examine the conduct of the individuals who had participated in falsified enforcement activity. In other words, they had not just lost, they had been exposed. He read it twice, not out of disbelief, but because his mind, conditioned by months of psychological warfare and legal ambiguity, needed repetition to accept resolution. When he finally set the letter down, the weight in his chest did not lift so much as it redistributed. The fight was over, but the tension had been etched into his posture like callus into skin. Victory wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, quiet exhale. Over the following days, subtle changes rippled through the neighborhood. The painted directional line behind his property was scrubbed clean. The flags never returned. Notices at the community market vanished overnight. Karen's porch lights stayed off longer into the evenings, and her car, once parked confidently near the front walk, now appeared further down her own driveway, angled away from the street like someone trying not to be noticed. No apologies came. No acknowledgments. Just silence. Different this time. Less ominous, more defeated. The network of fear that had held so many residents in passive complicity began to loosen. Thomas received nods from people who had once averted their eyes. A man with a trimmed beard and weathered hands stopped at his fence to say, without context, "Good firewood season this year." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ellen called to check in. She didn't speak of retribution or lawsuits or media coverage. That wasn't her style, and it certainly wasn't Thomas's. "What matters," she said, "is that you stood long enough for the truth to catch up." They agreed to keep monitoring for any aftershocks, any desperate plays by the remnants of that self-appointed board. But there was a calm in her voice now, one that hadn't been there in months. The strategy had held. The preparation had mattered. As for the fire pit, it became more than a fire pit. It wasn't a shrine or a monument, but it was known now. It was seen. Neighbors who once watched from behind blinds occasionally came closer. A few asked questions about the build, the stone, the airflow. One elderly man, after quietly listening to Thomas explain the process of venting a flame to reduce smoke drift, murmured, "Always thought those things were just for show. Didn't realize how much thought went into it." Thomas didn't correct him. He just smiled. But it wasn't about becoming a leader. He didn't host gatherings or initiate block-wide reforms. That had never been the point. The real victory was quieter.